Well, good evening, friends. It's wonderful to be with you. My name is Josh, and I'm on the team here. I wonder if you've ever been in the presence of greatness. If you've ever been with, or even just near a person who is remarkable, just a bit different, on another plane entirely. Many of us may have had an experience like that, of being in a certain situation where you just take a step back and think, wow, I'm in the presence of greatness. I wonder if that conjures up any particular memories for you. For me, it's a time when I was at school in year 9 or 10, and Prince Charles, now King Charles, came to my school. And all of us students got carted out onto the football pitch to listen to him give a speech. And truth be told, I can't remember a word he said. Your Majesty, if you're watching, it was fantastic. But I don't remember what happened in the speech, but afterwards, he came down from the podium into the crowd of us students and started to walk through, chatting to a few people. And I saw him chatting to some of the year 7s at the front, and he was making his way towards us. And then he started coming quite close to me, and I wondered whether he might just come and talk to me. Maybe I was the reason he'd come to our school. And he got closer, and he approached, and he stopped right next to me, and he turns towards me, and he strikes up conversation with Archie, stood next to me. No hard feelings, Archie. But even in that moment, even when I wasn't talking to him, I was completely absorbed by him. I was enveloped in everything he was saying, all his stories from serving in the military, all the people he'd met during his time serving the country, all the counsel he gave, all the wisdom he had, all his mannerisms. Everything he did and said and thought, I was completely fixated upon him. It's true, though, isn't it, that something happens to us in the presence of greatness. Our eyes become transfixed on that person. We become entirely enveloped in everything they're doing and everything that they are. I wonder how many of us have been to see Wicked recently, either at the theatre in Sunderland or in the cinema. It's a great story. For the longest time, the protagonist Elphaba, she's after one thing. She's longing one thing, and that thing is to be with the wizard. All the time, she wants to be with the wizard. She wants to be in his presence. She wants to be in the presence of greatness. She sings, and I will say, not sing, once I'm with the wizard, my whole life will change. And then later on, and I'll stand there with the wizard feeling things I've never felt. And though I'd never show it, I'd be so happy I could melt. And so it will be for the rest of my life. And I'll want nothing else till I die. You see, for Elphaba and for us, in the presence of greatness, the defining feature of who we are doesn't actually come from within us, but it comes from the person that we are with. And as I stood next to King Charles, I felt some of that. I felt more whole almost. My stresses and dissatisfactions, they sort of faded away. My chronic tendency to overthink just ceased for a moment, because the most important thing about me in that moment, it felt, was that I was with him. And this, in many ways, is where the story of humanity starts. The story of humanity starts. The man and woman, they're in the garden with God. They're in the presence of greatness, in the presence of God himself, and they walk with him and talk with him each and every day. And their eyes are transfixed on him, on his kindness to them and his provision for them. It's being in God's presence that defines who they are. They don't search introspectively for wholeness or meaning or satisfaction. They don't look inwards and downwards to find those things. No, for wholeness and meaning and satisfaction, they look upwards and outwards to God. The most important thing about them was not anything that came from within, but it was who they were with. But then comes a moment where the man and women are tempted. They have everything they need, but they're tempted. Tempted by what? Well, this was the temptation, to have their eyes opened, to see as God sees, to no longer be defined primarily by the great one whom they are with, but to define themselves on their own terms. In short, they don't want God to be their God any longer. They want to be their own God. And that's where our first reading that Chloe read to us so beautifully starts. And what's fascinating about what we heard, or what fascinates me at least, is this. They want to be their own God, and God honors their choice. He says, okay, you can be your own God, but they couldn't be their own God in the presence of the true God. So what happens? The true God has to send them outside of his presence, where they can try to be their own God. The man and woman are exiled from the presence of greatness. And they are exiled into what? Well, into obscurity and insignificance, into inner turmoil, into disappointment, into shame. They're exiled away from the presence of greatness and into the presence of, self. Into the presence of self. So much for being their own God. Away from greatness and into a life of having to find their peace and their satisfaction and their contentment, no longer by looking upwards and outwards to God, but by looking inwards and downwards into themselves. I threw out some feelings, some emotions 30 seconds ago. I wonder if any of them resonated with you. Discontent, dissatisfied, longing for peace, for satisfaction, for meaning, but unable to find it in your own presence. Well, if that's you, welcome to the club. You've joined a club to which every human being throughout history has belonged. We all long to be in the presence of God because that's where we have meaning and wholeness and satisfaction, and we are given an identity that we don't have to drum up ourselves, but comes from the one who gives it to us. But here we are in 2024, and we still want everything that comes from the presence of greatness. All those things I've just mentioned. But put bluntly, we're in the presence of self. And so what do we have to do? We have to make ourselves great, don't we? If it comes from greatness, then we try to build ourselves up. So what do? We expend all our effort and our energy to this end on self-improvement, on performance. We might attach our worth to money or to the music we play or to sport or to relationships, to sex, to amassing greatness of our own. And that's exactly what our passage in Genesis describes, isn't it? Did you hear it? Through painful toil you will eat from the ground, God says to the man. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground. And isn't that piece of Hebrew poetry just the sharpest commentary on our life today? Painful toil and the sweat of our brow, all in the pursuit of building our own greatness, building our own kingdom, so that in our own presence we can find the wholeness and contentment and satisfaction that we all long for. We try our hardest to make ourselves great, but there's a moment for all of us, and we probably experience it every day, where we realize that nothing we can do and build of ourselves is going to satisfy. And so the realization hits, we want greatness, but we're going to have to settle for mediocrity. C.S. Lewis, the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, says this: if we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And this longing of the human heart to have our desires truly satisfied, i.e. to be in the presence of greatness, in the presence of God, I think it's shown nowhere more clearly than in our second and third readings. These are prophecies written about 700 years before Jesus came onto the scene. And they're promises which the Jewish people of the Old Testament held on to dearly and awaited. They prayed and prayed and longed for the fruition of these promises, for the advent of someone who would take them from their obscurity, their insignificance, and restore them to greatness. Let's hear these words again. Isaiah prophesied this about the Messiah to come. Of the greatness of his government and peace, there will be no end. Micah prophesied this: They will live securely, for then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And why were they so excited about greatness? Because they knew that the great one to come was going to be the wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. The one, as Micah writes, who would stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. And it was generation after generation after generation of this Jewish people who longed for this great one to come. The one who would counsel them and father them and give them lasting peace, shepherd them with his kindness and strength. And yet, their story of thousands of years of longing, it's not just human history. That very story is unfolding in my life and your life today. That longing for our feeling of obscurity and insignificance to come to an end. Longing to be in that moment and place, in the presence of greatness where nothing else matters. Where we feel whole and we feel safe, solely by looking at and being with someone else, someone great, someone perfect. That was the cry of their hearts. It's the cry of my heart, and I submit it to you, it's probably the cry of your heart too. But where do we go from here? That's a slightly hopeless message, isn't it? Great, thanks, Josh. We've seen that we all long to be in the presence of greatness, ultimately the presence of God, for it's there that we find meaning. But just as you can't waltz into Buckingham Palace tomorrow morning, we're all far too common for that. You can't just waltz into the presence of God. We're all far too selfish and deceitful and mean and sinful for that. You can't simply waltz into the presence of greatness. And as we're going to hear now in our next readings, the presence of greatness has to come to you. So let's hear our next readings. I don't know how many of us were fans of Santa's Grotto when we were younger. Any? More interesting question, off script. Has anyone been Santa in a Santa's Grotto? A few. Let's go, Chris. There's a reason we get so excited about these, I think. And it's not just the Christmas cheer, it's not just the festive season. We saw in our first 3 readings that we are made to be in the presence of greatness, for there we are made whole. But we recognize too that you can't just waltz your way into the presence of greatness. Greatness has to come to you. And so Santa's Grotto is a glimpse of that, I think, isn't it? It's that moment once a year, and we've awaited it for 12 months, when someone who's different from us, greater than us, from a faraway land, comes to our ordinary little life. And he promises to give us what we ask for. Someone greater comes to where we are and gives us a moment, albeit a fleeting one, but a moment of bliss and satisfaction. It's the presence of greatness in our midst. And the message of the Christmas story, the claim of Jesus' birth, is that you can be in the presence of greatness. And not just be in it, but live in it, and live there forevermore in the presence of God. And not because you merit it or are deserving of it, not because you've earned it, not because you're on God's nice list rather than his naughty list. And it's not even because you were born for greatness. No, it's because greatness himself was born for you. As Matthew and Luke write in their eyewitness accounts of Jesus' life, which we've just heard to us, God truly was born as a baby. His greatness, his highness, his splendor, his majesty, the majesty of Christ the King was born. His greatness, born where and how? Not as you might expect. He wasn't born into the human greatness of the palace of Tiberius Caesar, or into the courts of Herod, Tetrarch of Galilee, or into the family of Philip, Tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis. I'm glad Verity had to read those and not me. He wasn't born into the human facade of pomp and ceremony, no. He was born into scandal, to a virgin girl, as Matthew writes, and born where? In Bethlehem, which, as we heard from the prophet Micah, was small among the clans of Judah. And the message came through who? Through an eccentric, seemingly insane man called John, who lived in the desert, in the wilderness. Why? His greatness was born. Why there? Why then? Well, this is why. Because he was born for me. He was born for me. And the truth is this: I don't lead a life of greatness. I haven't accumulated greatness in my life. I haven't found the secret to contentment and satisfaction in my own presence. I don't lead a life where inner peace comes to me particularly easily. No, I lead a life of insignificance and obscurity, of shame, of guilt, of pain, of worry, of anxiety, where I am selfish, where I am angry, where I lie, where I am deceitful, where I get worried, where I am embarrassed. I lead a life of sin. Hey, I'm Josh, great to meet you. Who wants to... It's not a great advert, is it? But Jesus was born for me. He came for me. He came to my very level, as lowly and as sinful as I am. And he promised to stay with me forever. And because of that, because of Jesus' birth that first Christmas, I can say with confidence that I will live in the presence of greatness, in the presence of God forevermore. It's not just rhetoric. It's not just a nice turn of phrase. It's real. In my sorrow and my grieving and my pain, I live in the presence of God. And then in my rejoicing and celebration, I live in the presence of God, in the big things and the small. I was thinking about this even last night. I got home from work and Storm Dara had exposed a hole in my roof. And there was a bit of water dripping on the landing and in the living room. And so I was a bit frustrated. I sat down, almost cried, stressed about where I'm going to get the money from to pay for it. Yes, I felt all of that, but I felt it in the presence of God, because that's where I will live forever. The very presence of God, it's what we're focusing on as a church this Christmas, was born for me that I would live in it forever. And so I don't cry or laugh. I don't face sorrow or celebration just in the presence of self. I don't face it in the presence of the human facade of greatness. No, I face it in the true presence of greatness, in the presence of Almighty God, who sustains me, who satisfies me with his love every night as I go to bed, who pours out his mercy on me afresh every morning so that my mistakes and my failures and my sin are forgiven. All of that because Jesus was born that first Christmas. And so, if you're anything like me, worried, anxious, discontent, regretful, shameful, in mourning, in grieving, sinful, I could name all sorts of things. If you're anything like me, then he was born for you too. You were born to live in the presence of greatness. You were born to live in the presence of God forevermore. And to enable that to happen, greatness himself has come to be present in you. His greatness was born into the embarrassment of abject poverty so that you could be restored to honor in God's presence. His greatness was born into vulnerability, entirely dependent on his mother Mary, so that you could be restored to authority as beloved daughters and sons of the High King of heaven. His greatness was born into the worthlessness of scandal, so that you could find your worth not within yourself, but by being with him, by being in his presence. And then that boy grew up, and 30 years later, his greatness took on our sin and defeated it, so that you and I could be welcomed back into the presence of God with open arms. And so here's my question for you today. Do you want to wake up tomorrow still living in the presence of self? Still having to look inwards to find your hope and your joy? Still having to look downwards to find meaning and satisfaction? Still looking to yourself for greatness? Or do you want, in this very moment, and you can experience this in this very moment, do you want to begin to live in the presence of God? We got one. Job well done. In the presence of God, where you look upwards for your peace, where you look outwards for your identity, you can begin to live in the reality of the presence of God. Because we heard it in the reading from Matthew. The virgin really did conceive. And she really did give birth to a son. And they really did call him Emmanuel, which truly does mean God in all his greatness with us. Amen. Can I invite you to stand as we sing our next carol?